Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We're going to continue our discussion of leadership. We're interested in the topic because we want to know whether it makes a difference in value creation. We're a little bit skeptical. Value creators don't necessarily need to be leaders. They need to be great technicians in applying the value creation method and the value creation algorithm. They'd be better at it than others, but that's not necessarily leadership as it's taught in business school. But we may be all wrong. And today we have an expert to help guide us through this question of what is leadership and how should we think about it.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Today we have an expert. It's Dr. Amanda Goodall. Let me read from her bio. Amanda is the Professor of Leadership at Bayes Business School, City University of London. She specializes in how leaders and managers influence performance, which is exactly what we're looking for. She has a degree from the London School of Economics and a PhD from Warwick Business School, both focused on leaders' characteristics. She's been widely published and is viewed as the very top in her field of leadership studies. Professor Goodall, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's a great honor and pleasure on our part. We're trying to study leadership and, in fact, understand the phenomenon in business. And that includes a rather skeptical question whether there's such a thing as leadership in business, and we'll get to discuss that. The reason we're skeptical is because there seems to be a little bit of manufacturing going on, that leadership was cooked up in business schools and elsewhere, and it's very profitable to sell leadership courses and leadership books, and you pay $100,000 to Harvard University, you can have a Harvard certificate. And the other side of it is there's plenty of alternatives to leadership theory. We might talk about some of those. But you're an expert, Amanda. You study leadership. You're a professor of leadership. I thought we might start there. Tell us about the academic field of leadership studies. Is it empirical? Is it theoretical? Is it a combination of both? What's its history?
Yeah, I think it's very good place to start. I've been researching leadership for about 20 years. It's my area of research. I came into academia as a mature person, though, having worked with leaders, actually. So that was where the hypothesis came from. In terms of the research field, I mean, it has a kind of a funny old history. It's been through all the sort of different stages of psychology, and all the different fads that have been reflected in society have happened also in leadership. Various things about inheritance and, God, I can't remember, what was it called again? Trait theories. Things like that were massive in leadership because that was a kind of mirror image of what people were thinking about in other parts of the world. So, and in other areas of study. So in a way, leadership just sort of emulates the movement through society in terms of, how society is thinking. Then there's a reflection on leadership. And that probably is the same in different social science disciplines as well, and possibly even the sciences. In terms of leadership as a discipline, yeah, it's very interesting. It's not a discipline. It's part of the social sciences. It comes up in economics in various different fields. But when I first came into it, I was rather skeptical. One of the things that I kind of often say is, if you stop someone randomly on the street and you said, there's been 100,000 articles on leadership, there's been hundreds of books on leadership, and you stop this random person on the street with your clipboard and you said, tell me what you know to be true about leadership, what you know to be absolutely true. And I guess someone might say, and this is my kind of usual retort, well, we know we don't want a narcissistic nutter to be heading an organization or a country. And we'd have to say, well, we leadership researchers have really failed in that case. So, I mean, I think there has been a lot of fads around leadership. There's been a lot of theory around leadership. I'm afraid you're talking to someone who's very cynical about theory on the whole. I think my field management has just got so much theoretical BS in it, I would say, stuff that I don't think is really applicable. I'm an empiricist. It doesn't mean I don't have a theory. I've developed this thing called a theory of expert leadership. That's come out of evidence and it's been built up from evidence, I suppose. But I have to say, the reason I did this research was because I actually observed leaders in in higher education, but in 3 different universities and 2 countries. And I noticed a difference in their behavior, their preferences, their decision making. And so I decided to look at that question further and try and see if I could find something that was coming close to a generalizable pattern. Because that's what I do think is missing off in leadership research, is that going back to that very first question, that clipboard in my hand, asking that man on the street, what do we know to be true? I'm hoping that, this research at least will give us some insight into a pattern that I have found now across every kind of organizational setting. Now, it doesn't mean that it's generalizable. It doesn't mean that every single organization will practice it. There's always outliers, etc., as in all social science research or scientific research. But when it comes to leadership stuff, I'm with you. I do think, and maybe we'll talk about that later, that leadership some factors of that can be learned. But I think we might go on to talk about the difference between leadership and management, which is another hot topic for me.
Okay, well, let's get there. But can we define leadership at the beginning, or try to? And I've been thinking about this, Amanda, while reading your book. And we just talked to Moshe Temkin about leaders in history. And the question is, does history create leaders, or does leaders create history? And the question in business for that, I think, is what happens as a result of leadership that wouldn't have happened otherwise? I don't know whether that's a good definition, but is there a definition of leadership in your mind before we get to the pattern?
I've read so many student essays, and they all start with, no disrespect, but they all start with, how do we define leadership? And in a way, that's a very sensible place to start. How do we define the term that we're then going to go on and discuss? That is a fair place to start. I guess I come from the school of thought where, going to my point about differentiating between leaders and managers, I think that's been a big topic of discussion. And as far as I'm concerned, a leader has to be a manager beforehand. Maybe someone might say Napoleon was different, or some of these other big political leaders that are in Temkin's book. But they will have had to work their way through some ranks or other. They weren't, unless they were, born into it through some monarchy, they would have had to work their ranks through it, whether they were a good leader, a dictator, whatever they were. And including in organizations, people have to be managers before they can go on and be leaders. We don't have a divine right in the social sciences. Yeah, it's interesting. I do think that they make a big difference. I evidence this with leaders that I work with, and I could see a difference in what they were doing. And we give leaders a hell of a lot of power. We pay them a lot of money. It would be weird to think that they didn't make a difference, really. And that's not every single leader. Everyone's different, whether it's a leader or a manager, everyone's different. But yeah, I think they can make a big difference. And obviously there's other factors in there. There may be other factors that meant that, well, we know because it's been talked about around populism right now, that there was precursors to the rise of Hitler and to what happened in Germany in the 1930s. And there'll be precursors to all of these movements, of course, whether it's in Russia or Germany or the United States around Trump. So that there'll be a conflation of a lot of things. But I still think if that leader person wasn't there, would there be another person to take the place of Trump? Probably, but probably not quite the same as Trump. So I do think they make a difference as well. But I also think there are many variables at play.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get to the pattern that you call expert leadership. I'm going to read a quote from your book just to set it up. The evidence underlying the principles of expert leadership clearly shows that organizations led by specialists in the core business perform better than those that are not. And this has been found to be the case across all types of business. So there's a lot of components in there, but let's start there as the case for the pattern.
Yes, well, that's kind of a statement that wouldn't cut muster in one of my academic journals, that's for sure. But I will say that after that statement comes a lot of evidence. The pattern or the observation in the beginning started when I worked, as I said, with university leaders, and I noticed one a sociologist called Anthony Giddens, who was at London School of Economics, who I worked with after I did my undergraduate degree as a very mature student. And then I worked with someone else in Chicago and then worked with someone else in the UK. And I noticed their behavior was different. And that led me to ask this question: in a research university, who should lead? Should it basically be a good manager or a good scholar? And that's kind of what started me off on this. And I can remember sitting in bed on literally back of an envelope. This is when citations had to be manually counted. And counting the citations of Larry Summers at the time, who had other behavioral things, as we will remember, but a brilliant economist nevertheless. And essentially what I found was across the world universities and in longitudinal data in UK universities, I found that leaders who were great scholars went on to take their universities, continue down that pattern of being a great research university. And the question a lot of people asked at the time, and they still do, and rightly so, is which way does causality go? Does Harvard get great and then bung a good researcher on it? Or is Harvard what it is today because it's had a series of top researchers on it? And I can tell you honestly now, after having looked at this for a long time, it goes that way round. Basically, the great researchers lead to great research universities. And it doesn't need to mean that every single one is an outstanding researcher, but on average, they are. So that's where it all started. And then I felt, I'm kind of giving you a history of where I went, but then I started to think, well, what other data could I use to examine this hypothesis? And that's when I started looking at, I looked at academic departments, I looked at business schools, I found the same thing. I looked at Formula One racing, which is, we had 12 years or 11 years of racing data. And I found that the most successful, they're called principals in F1, team leaders, were more likely to have started their careers as drivers. I looked at basketball, again, with others, with two economists, one Larry Kahn at Cornell and one in the UK. And we found that the best basketball players made the best coaches. And basically trying to replicate this pattern, I looked at hospitals. Hospitals is kind of, healthcare is where I've stayed for a long time. I run a program actually for doctors in leadership and management, which we might come back to. And I found, the best hospitals in the world are more likely to be led by doctors than general managers. And the top two hospitals in the world, repeatedly the top two, are the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic, and they have only ever been led by physicians. And that's quite nice for a social scientist because there ain't no argument about which way causality goes, because they've only ever known physician leaders. So I've been replicating and replicating. The most recent study, which we're still writing up, but that I've summarized in the book, was looking at every single company in the country of Denmark. Denmark collects this fantastic data called administrative data, and they collect information on every single organization, small and large, and all that, their leadership, the number of staff, their performance, etc. So in these data over 18 years, and it's 30,000 companies, we can see that the companies that go on to be the most successful were either, were led by the person who started them, which is a comment to your field of entrepreneurship, but also, or they'd worked their way up in the organization. So I don't know if that's quite a long response. I hope that's okay.
No, it's wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. And there are some principles behind that, as you mentioned in the paragraph that I read. And I didn't mean to fail to point out that there's a heck of a lot of empirical and academic research behind all of this. So we're just floating over the top of it. I understand that. But why is that the case? Why do expert leaders have that positive effect where others might not? Can we itemize some principles?
So just to run through the principles of expert leadership, I guess the first principle for me, and we will go on to talk about core business, I'm sure, is that an organization's core business should determine its leader. So the core business, the main business should determine its leader. And I'm not sure that that's always thought about, or particularly in the United States, in Britain, I don't think that's necessarily always the first thing that's thought about. I think it is in certain industries. The other side of that is that you really want someone who is a specialist or an expert in the industry, work themselves up, and ideally someone who is proficient to a high standard in that core activity. The reason for that is that what you ideally want is if I don't know, use an engineering firm or an IT firm or whatever, if you have someone who was really rubbish at their practice of core business, if they were a lawyer and they were really not a good lawyer, it's very unlikely that a law firm is going to want that, is going to say to that person, you're not a good lawyer, let's put you into a leadership or management role and we can have you there. It's unlikely that you're going to want to have at the top of the organization someone who really couldn't cut muster in the core business. You don't want a bad doctor leading a hospital. You don't want a bad marketing person leading a marketing department, because others won't see them as credible. So that's kind of the first one and the main point, I suppose. I also think the term expert applies in all settings. I think that there's always a discussion about what the core business is. There's always a discussion, which we will no doubt go on to have, which is what if the core business changes in this, that, and the other? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But, if you put your mother or father into a care home, you really want ideally to know that the person leading that has some experience of running care homes, that who understands what good carers are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it applies really across all industries and businesses, ideally. And then that's an ideal type. And you might not get that person all the time, and we can talk about that later. I think they're also needed throughout the organization. Now, I talk about leadership in this book. I talk about a lot about the top of the organization, the CEO type level, but I spend as much of my research looking at middle managers, at line managers. And I think you want an expert leader, whether you're talking about an HR department, whether you're talking about a marketing department, whether you're talking about, and certainly in the core business functions. So if we take a university as an example, we want someone at the top of the university who understands, if we're a research university, great research and teaching and all the other stuff. And fundraising, of course, is a massive thing in the United States. But then I also want to know that the person who's heading up my department of management, my faculty and my business school are also really good researchers as well, that they understand the components of research and teaching, that I can look to my line managers, I can look to my head of the business school and say, that person, I really respect that person. They've done well in their career. They're signaling success, et cetera, et cetera. So I think experts are all throughout the organization. This isn't just about the core business function, but fundamentally, it's got to be about the core business function, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you're saying it's distributed at the department level and the function level, but it's also applicable at the top.
Yeah, it's also big up, but I'm also saying in other peripheral functions that are important. You don't want to put in HR someone who's, I don't know, come from selling hamburgers or whatever. You want someone who's a great HR person there. The same thing applies. The HR department wants to have someone who they think is really credible and who is good at what they do. So it can apply throughout the organization, essentially. But the main point is core business.
Yeah. So just let me probe that, Amanda, so I understand it. So I was trying to think through examples, and Reed Hastings at Netflix often comes up as a great leader because, it's reflected in the results that they've had, and he changed the industry and so on. He was a techie, he was a coder, he built a software company, which he personally says he was disappointed in the outcome of it. He started Netflix mailing DVDs to homes, and now it's become the entertainment streaming giant that it is. And he's a great CEO, but what's the core business there that he was particularly expert in? How can I relate what you say to Reed Hastings as an example?
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point. Now, Reed Hastings was behind something which was kind of the next step to Blockbuster. It was moving online. It was a new technology. I would say two things. Firstly, both him and his partner came out of some kind of technological or, some awareness of technology. They weren't coming from, they weren't, they may have been guitarists, but they both came from that kind of area, right? And I think what's really interesting about him is his first company, Pure Software. He learned a lot from that, actually. What's in the book that he learned from that was that, and I think this is also very interesting, is that the company may well have been successful, but what he did was he got to that typical point that a lot of entrepreneurs get to, where they're going from sort of, smaller to getting bigger. And there's a few examples I have in the book about this. And he just assumed that when a company got bigger, it had to put in lots of bureaucracy into the organization. And that's how, bureaucracy was what happened when organizations got bigger. And he did that in pure software. And basically what he did was he squeezed out all the technical experts that he had, who he started off with. They didn't like this new bureaucracy. They didn't like the fact they had to tick all these boxes and fill in all these forms, etc. So they left. So when Java came in, he says they weren't prepared for it because a lot of the experts had gone, and he'd created an organization where the sort of bureaucrats is possibly too heavy a term, but the people who understood the kind of processes and wanted those kinds of processes were happy. The really ingenious thinkers, the specialists, they left. And he says that in his own book. So what he learned from that process actually was that technical experts need autonomy. They do not need to be, squashed down with bureaucracy. And that is a point now today, because I think school teachers, academics, hospital workers, whether they're nurses, doctors, whoever, everyone has got so much bureaucracy now. His point is really important. Now, I think his company would have succeeded had he known what he knows now about bureaucracy and all of that. But he didn't. He wasn't prepared for the changes in industry because all the experts had gone, essentially, because of the processes he put in. So I think there is learning from him, definitely.
Yeah, so what I'm getting from that a little bit, Amanda, is that expert leaders know enough to unleash or free the other experts in the rest of the company, and they feel comfortable doing that.
Exactly.
There's an interesting new book out by Andy McAfee called The Geek Way, and he's examining it from that aspect, but he says openness and autonomy are the keys in the new tech companies.
But you see, you have to be one of them to allow that to happen. I have to understand what you do exactly to be able to give you that autonomy. If I know nothing about what you do, what am I likely to do? I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to put this process in because I don't really know what you're doing. So you better tick this box so that I know where you are at this time when you've gone through all these hoops. And that's in a sense what Reed Hastings did when he had his first company. And it's that autonomy. Now it takes someone who really understands the workforce, their team, to give them that autonomy. They have to be able to, they have to trust them to know what they're doing. So from that comes trust and all those things. But you really have to understand what they're doing if you want to give them autonomy and let them get on with something. And if you don't understand it, you can't give them autonomy, which is why we're living in a bureaucratized world, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the other side of the case, I just struggle a little bit with this core function question. So I've been a lot in the world where we're writing software to achieve marketing goals. And so what's the core of that business? Is it software or marketing? And one of the things I found is software writers are not marketers. That's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would say is marketing, 100% marketing. So one of the examples I think exemplifies this and why I think it's marketing is that we'll all remember when J.C. Penney were doing very badly. And they hired Ron Johnson as its CEO in 2011, this was. And of course, he'd set up the Genius bars, the Mac Genius bars, and Apple Store, and had done extremely well. And J.C. Penney thought, well, we really need someone like that to breathe new life into our technology and to create J.C. Penney's for the future, etc. So he came in. As we all know, it failed massively. The company lost nearly $100 million. They lost 22,000 employees. Now, a lot of analysis has gone into that. And one of the main things is that basically he didn't understand the marketplace of JCPenney. He didn't understand the customer. He hadn't done a turnaround. But I think fundamentally, you have to understand the JCPenney customer. Then you add the other stuff. So if you understand the customer, then you might add the marketing. Then you might add the tech that supports the marketing. Then you might add the whatever it is that supports the tech, etc. But it all starts with the customer. If you want to keep the same customer, of course, which, I'm imagining that they did. They weren't trying to reinvent themselves into Apple Mac. So I would say absolutely in your position, it's the marketing, and the tech has got to fit the marketing. Basically, it's got to, that if you put a tech person in, many companies did this around the sort of the rise of technology. They thought, quick, we must put a tech expert in as CEO. And of course, there was many cases of it failing, just like the JCPenney example, because these people understand tech, but tech is like, I don't know, it's the paper that makes up the book. It's not the book. It's not the content of the book. And so I would say in your case, you just given me 100% marketing.
Yeah. Oh, we're 100% behind you on that. Thank you. And starting with the customer and understanding the customer, we endorse that point of view. So let's just look at the other side, Amanda. The leadership industry may have got this wrong. Part of your book is saying what leadership is not, and it's not a general management approach. It's not we accuse business schools, so let me call it the business school approach to leadership, which is about general management in opposition to what you've just said about expertise. So fill us in about that. How did we get it wrong?
So I would say that, and this isn't my area of research, but I do cover it in the book, but when the apocryphal postboy could work their way up the American corporate and become CEO, a nice concept from the past that I absolutely 100% do not think would happen today. There was an understanding that at least, that post boy, as he undoubtedly would have been, learned enough about the industry and the business because he worked his way up through it. And that was the norm up until kind of, the 40s approximately, when Taylorism came around, which he was around in the 30s, the first management consultant, in fact, or that's how he's described. And I'm no expert in this, but from what I've read, he basically separated those at the coalface, who he considered to be the brawn of the company, from what he considered to be the brains, who he now decided were the managers. And this kind of separation happened and carried on into the 1950s. And there was also a move between family-owned companies and getting larger and bringing in managers, etc., and many other things which are documented by many other brilliant scholars and writers. But business schools used to exist in a very early form. So you'd have like a school. I was looking up the various schools, and there was one in Glasgow working with engineers in sort of, I don't know, on the Clyde, helping them understand kind of, the books and stuff like that. And then there'll be the civil service had their own thing, and organizations had their own sort of tailored type of business and management stuff, actually. And then with business schools and the idea of the general manager, again, I think it was also a kickback against the kind of more, it's a kickback against this hierarchy of ownership, really, when it broadened out into kind of greater democracy in terms of positions in corporates, and it wasn't just the owners that got to run the show, took over. And again, this isn't my area of research, so I'm badly summarizing it all, but they started to offer more general degrees and things like MBAs. And the idea was that you could get trained in these kind of tools that you could then carry around from industry to industry, a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to management and leadership, if you like. And yeah, I think they were wrong. I think they were entirely wrong in many ways, actually. And in fact, even though I think the MBA still has a place today, although MBAs, on the whole, have struggled for a few years to find, that their position in the market has moved, I would say. I'm a great advocate of management and leadership education, but I'm much more about looking back to the old ways and tailoring it to suit people, suit the right kind of people. So, for example, we've created this 50 billion ridiculous leadership industry with this concept of kind of generic leadership and management. And I mean, I just find that completely bizarre. We would never say that, one type of engineer can fix every kind of car. And that's a car, for God's sake. Why do we think that, a human being can understand what it's like to manage in a hospital versus a manufacturing plant? Now, I would say that I think management consulting firms have also played their part in all of this massively. And in fact, management consultants firms make a lot more money than business schools do now. So they are the kind of generic leaders of this. And what's really interesting is to turn the lens in on them. You will never, ever find a Deloitte, a McKinsey, a PwC, a KPMG who isn't run by someone who basically was born in the basement and worked their way up through the organization. You will never be able to fly in an external, maybe to a particular post, specialist post, but at the very top, these are people who have been there for many, many years. So the irony is that you've got these massive management consulting firms going into organizations. The money that the public sector, both in the US, UK, and around the world, spends on management consultancies is obscene as far as I'm concerned. You've got people coming into these organizations who know nothing about them whatsoever, telling them how they should do things. And most of the time, it's amazing how many stories I hear about what a waste of money it's been from the people inside. They would never ask anyone else to go into them and give them any advice. They do not preach what they themselves practice. And that to me is the biggest crime, actually. And I find that really bad. And I also think they are de-skilling the civil service and many other areas, but they are big promoters of this idea that, what they do is generic, right? They want to go into all these different organizations. So I would say they are the carriers now of this more than business schools.
Yeah, they're the Taylorism of the modern age. One of the points that you make in the book, you have this lovely phrase about what the problem is with that kind of generalist approach. You say it's accountancy infused and it's metric obsessed. And we have a particular interest in the area of metrics because we tend to be subjectivists, and therefore we think that there's too much attempt to mathematically measure what is more emotional and subjective. But tell us a little bit what you were thinking about with metric obsessed. Is that part of the problem that leads to bureaucracy?
Yes, and that's other people's work that I've cited in that area about the kind of I can't remember what the book is called now, sort of the madness of metrics, but it's something like that. And it's an excellent book. But yes, so I think we have. And I'll give you my hypothesis, and that is that as experts have become further removed from management and leadership, so people who do not understand the core business have gone into those positions. That's why I think they have imposed metrics and various different kinds of measurements that basically control what they can't look at. They can't make judgments, right? Which is what it used to be. It used to be judgment-based assessments in all of our worlds. Someone else was making a judgment about the work of an employee or someone that they manage because they knew what they were doing and they could make those judgments. These days, we get imposed on us systems and metrics from government, often come down from government, by people who have no idea what we're doing. So they impose these ridiculous metrics on us, which don't measure what they think that they should measure. And I think it's because non-experts are controlling experts, and that's a way of doing it, number one. And I would say that governments don't like experts, really. I mean, there's been lots of cases of this. I think expertise has declined massively in the last 20, 30 years. Respect for it. I think politicians don't like experts. Why? Because if we are regulated by our own code of practice and rules, we're not going to say yes to everything. Again, I'm afraid if they walk into Deloitte and say, could you please turn the sky green? Deloitte will go, yeah, no problem. It'll cost you, a $5 gazillion or quid, but we'll turn the sky green for you. They won't say no to them. Whereas we who are experts who have got kind of regulations will. So I think that is part of the problem. And they want things to happen. So they use these metrics as a way of kind of forcing the behavior. It's like not being a dog and forcing my dog to go through funny hoops just because I can't put myself in my dog's shoes, in a sense. And that's what they're doing to us, I think.
I'm going to pick up a couple of benefit words that you use in the book, Amanda, about why expert leadership is desirable. You say they can generate and keep a clearer sense of purpose, a longer-term view. Why is that? Why are experts specially able to do that?
So if you look at quite a lot of the other people's literature, which I summarize in the book, we find that experts in leadership positions, and actually they've noticed this about STEM subject experts often, are more likely to invest in R&D. And in the very nature of investing in R&D, you're expecting some kind of longer term return, if you like, for that. That's why we invest in R&D. It isn't an overnight thing. It's something that takes a while to work through. So the idea is that people who are close to the industry, who want to stay in the industry, will take a longer view, and often they will invest in R&D, and they will not be looking for so much for the quick turnover. Now, other people's research has shown us that what we call generalist or non-industry expert CEOs are more likely to move around from industry to industry more frequently, And some of these people are picked up in the book. But they're also more likely to be paid more money. They have higher salaries. And that's because the evidence shows that the more you move around, each time you move, you push your salary up. Now, the differential in CEO salaries and the average worker salaries has gone up to something like 300 to 1. I mean, something ridiculous now. And I think that's been pushed up by lots of factors, of course, but partly by this generalist CEOs moving around and salaries being pushed up. That's not the whole, that doesn't explain everything, but that's part of it.
They're better at setting long-term purpose and communicating that. So I'm not sure what leads to it, but another claim you make is expert leaders create more productive workplaces. And that's very desirable. So again, can you make the link there? How did they do that?
That I can rely on my own research for. So one of the studies that we did, we looked at 35,000 US and UK employees who were matched with their firms. And we found in these two different data sets that the three factors that contributed mostly to employee job satisfaction were if your boss could do your job, if your boss either started the firm or worked their way up the organization. And the third thing was your assessment as an employee of your boss's technical ability. All of these factors were incredible predictors of high employee job satisfaction. And I've actually got the only diagram in the book is this diagram that comes out of that study, which shows that having an expert boss is worth double your pay to your job satisfaction. So literally twice the amount of your pay. So it kind of, this all falls in line with the sort of more casual thinking about people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses. And we found that also in another study about bad bosses. So your boss has the biggest effect on your job satisfaction. We found in one study, an expert boss has the largest effect, positive effect on your job satisfaction. Now, how do we link that to performance? There are numerous studies coming out, experimental studies that use big administrative data sets, various kinds of studies showing that job satisfaction is associated with individual performance and organizational productivity, right? There are numerous studies showing this now. So not only do we want happy workers for the sake of we want employees to be satisfied, there's a massive link now pointing to happy workers are more productive workers. And in a way, it kind of makes sense, right? So how that's going to roll out, I mean, an interesting thing which we probably won't get to in great detail today is how all of that rolls out in this current hybrid era. But certainly your boss, if you imagine it, if you think about the person when you're working in any kind of organization, the person that affects your life more than anyone is your boss. Your boss decides whether you can go on holiday, whether you can go up promotion, whether you can get leadership development training, whether you can, sit where you sit, everything actually. And for some people, it comes down to tiny little things that, and we know that autonomy is very important to job satisfaction as well. And in fact, in the book, I go through all the major factors of job satisfaction because it's so important to understand employee job satisfaction. But knowing that our boss has the strongest effect on our job satisfaction, and that's essentially our link with performance. Apart from the CEO, and we show a link at the organizational top showing that expert bosses are more likely to have organizational performance. And when we get down to the individual, we can see that expert line managers are more likely to raise job satisfaction of employees.
Yeah. And there's a related point there, Amanda, and that is that you say expert leaders exhibit greater emotional intelligence. And that was a bit jarring to me, because if you go back to McAfee's idea about geeks, if they're experts, they're going to be geeky and focused and intense and maybe not have emotional intelligence. That was a great finding. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure which you're actually talking about on that specific one, but where it is. I must admit, I didn't look that one up again because I'm not sure if that was it on its own. I haven't looked at emotional intelligence and experts. What I have done, I mean, I've certainly taught it. So I'm not quite sure where it is in the book that I say that. Sorry to be vague. The one thing that I think is really important, which is in my principles, which we sort of strayed off them halfway through, but a really important point which would link to this all the way through the book and all the way through my life since I've been doing this research, I've always said expertise is not a proxy for leadership and management knowledge and education. So I don't think that an expert on its own, especially in this day and age, is necessarily going to have emotional intelligence or be a naturally great leader. I would agree with you. Experts may be more likely to demonstrate hubris because, hey, I was a brilliant lawyer. That probably means I'm brilliant at everything. So no, I think experts, and why with the doctor's course, the first thing we do is hold that mirror up to them. And, the first thing I say to them is, you can be a brilliant doctor. We can give you all the strategy and leadership and finance stuff that you want. But if you're an asshole, it's not going to work. So behavior is absolutely so. I'm a big advocate of emotional intelligence. We talk a lot. We spend a lot of time on it. And we've also, there's a colleague of mine, a doctor in America at Cleveland Clinic, a co-author as well. He's done a study looking at whether you can teach emotional intelligence and whether it's retained. And he's found that it is, interestingly. But anyway, enlighten me if I said that.
No, I was going to look it up, but it's too fussy. I'll do it afterwards. I apologize if I got that wrong.
No, I'm sure you didn't. The thing about these kinds of books, honestly, is that, there's a lot of stuff in these books that, as I said, these are non-academic books. So there's a lot of stuff I've allowed myself to say in these. I would never allow myself to say another one. Doesn't mean I don't believe it, by the way. I do. But that one particularly, I actually do think that, and that's why I've got spotting and developing experts as 2 chapters, which I've brought other people in for, because I really think that actually there is no evidence to say that an expert is going to be any nicer a person or any more, have any more emotional intelligence. If I say that, then that's kind of wrong.
Okay, I'll look it up after we're finished and I'll send it to you. You mentioned where is this going to go in the future? And one of the things you say in the book, Amanda, is we need to motivate more experts to become leaders. And in the current environment, they may resist it. So we need expert-friendly companies. So tell us about that. What would an expert-friendly company look like?
So in a way, funnily enough, that goes back to Reed Hastings a bit. So in the back of the book, I talk about organizations that I think do it very well, and Reed Hastings brought in this with his colleague and wrote a book with Erin Mayer, which was No Rules, I think it's called, and No Rules. And it's basically was taken from his experience with pure software, and he basically dismantled the kind of rules system that he'd imposed on his pure software employees. And so I think an organization that respects expertise, and I do think this exists a lot more in Silicon Valley than it does in many parts of government and in many organizations, including universities and probably many healthcare organizations also. It's basically where an organization that turns the lens to the people that it wants to kind of create the best working environment from. And what I mean by that is everyone wants a working environment to suit them. But if someone who, say, just for argument's sake, is a kind of generalist manager, creates the work environment for a specialist or an expert, there's likely to be a conflict there. And the expert and specialists are the ones who are the hardest to find, and they'll just go away and find somewhere else to work that suits them. So we need to shine the light. We need to recognize who are the key players in this organization. In a hospital, who are the people, that will cease to function if we get rid of them, if we have low numbers of doctors and nurses and clinicians. We don't have a hospital. We can have as many managers as you want, and they can do really important jobs. But if you upset all of the core workers and they go, you haven't got anything. You can have a school with, lots of assistant teachers and all this kind of stuff. But if you've created a bureaucracy that is a nightmare for those school teachers, they're going to leave. And I will just tell you, in the UK, 40% of school teachers leave the public school system after something like 5 years. I mean, we're talking a lot of people leaving. In the NHS, doctors are marching out, nurses, etc., because the system isn't designed to suit these core workers. To me, this is the most important thing. The successful businesses are the ones that can retain those core workers and understand the kind of work environment that they need to be the most productive they can be in. And if they don't, they will leave the workforce. And these are the people that it's very, very difficult to replace. So that's what I mean by an expert-friendly environment. And I think now it's very important. I think we need to listen to experts now. We're in a position where climate change is, we're almost certainly gone past, the return possibility now. It's gotten so bad. And I think we really need to listen to experts in that capacity also. And in our country, so just to give you another example, our government has had in 13 years 8 different heads of the education department in this country, right? So civil servants and the education industry had to deal with 8 different leaders in 13 years. What does that say about, education? What does that person know about the education of all our young people? I mean, that's an insanity. So I think experts need to also get a bit of muscle and recognize how important they are in these organizations also. Of course they do. They all leave. And then governments go, oh no, we haven't got any doctors yet. Oh, great, we've got a 4 million waiting list as we've got now. I mean, these are the realities.
One of the trends I think that's positive in thinking about organization is, I put it under the heading of removing the barriers to the expert being able to do what they do. And bureaucracy is one of those barriers you can remove. Metrics might be another one if they're barriers. Compliance rules and those kinds of things where we can remove them. So that seems to be the opposite of historical management, where you're always adding things. You're adding layers and rules and departments and so on. Is that one way to get an expert-friendly organization, do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think that I think that's exactly right. Definitely. We have created these organizations that are so busy. I mean, I spend so much of my time box ticking certain things that have usually, as I said, come down from government. They think it's a good idea. They have no idea what we do, and they impose these things on us. And yes, I think that we absolutely need to do that. It doesn't mean that we're not responsible. We have to be responsible and all of those things. But I think we have been, too much external stuff has been imposed on various kinds of experts, and that has impinged their workplace. And there's lots of examples. And outsourcing, there was been an obsession with outsourcing again. I think that's caused a lot of problems. I think expertise has been diminished. Look at Boeing. Look at the fine that Boeing got and the sad events that happened there. They were outsourcing to 60 different providers for engines. I mean, can you imagine how the engineers can cope with that? They couldn't. And of course, it led to terrible deaths, and they got fined a huge amount of money in the end, Boeing.
Yeah. So let's end on this point. We lean towards the idea of revolution in a positive sense, that we're going to shed a lot of the bad things and bad trends that have built up in the 20th century in this new way of looking at things in the digital age. And I find what you say quite revolutionary in the sense that we'll shed all those general management principles, the accountancy infused and metrics obsessed kind of way of managing it, and find a new one. So can I get your endorsement in that? Is what you're saying revolutionary in that sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny to me when you use the term revolutionary. And it's so funny to me when people say to me, oh, what you're doing is really counterintuitive. And I say, really, it's counterintuitive that you want a hairdresser to run a hairdressing salon? You think that's counterintuitive? And I find it, to me, it's not revolutionary. It's kind of the bleeding obvious, actually, in a way.
Yeah, it's not counterintuitive, but it's counter-trend.
Counter-trend. And that's absolutely right, yes. So I'm totally a revolutionary with you. Where do I sign up?
Good. Well, you sign up at thevaluecreators.com. But more importantly, let's link people to your book. It's called Credible: The Power of Expert Leaders. We usually point people to Amazon. Is there anywhere else they can find you?
I don't mind, wherever they can.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for today. Thank you for what you've written. Thanks for all your research. It's very impressive, the amount of empirical and research data that you put behind this revolutionary opinion. So we thank you very much, and we hope a lot of people get value out of the book.
Thank you also for inviting me and for introducing me to your podcast. I'm definitely going to be signing up to it from now on.
Good. Thank you. We appreciate that. Thanks, Amanda.
Bye.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.